got up this whole assortment of trade period things. Basically, what this is about is American Indians have been in this hemisphere, in this part of the world, 15,000, 16,000 years, starting with the Paleo period and working through different periods, the Archaic, the Mid-Archaic, the Late Archaic, and all that, the Woodland and all that. Pretty much ending with what they call the Mississippi period, was kind of the contact period where Europeans began to come to the east coast of the country and make contact with the Indians. That quickly turned into the contact period. When Europeans were coming, realizing that there was a lot of resources there, and quickly finding out that there wasn't much gold, a lot of different groups had come in. The French had come in from Canada and developed a really strong trapping industry. The English were coming in and heading inland and met the French in New York State, Ohio Valley and all that, resulting in the French and Indian War. The Spanish were coming up from the south. And each group that made contact with the Indians had found one way or another to I guess, initially razzle-dazzle the Indians with things that they had so they can get things that the Indians had. Furs, whatever else. Some of the earliest things that were traded with the Indians were beads. I mean, they were very rich, very showy, very impressive. Indians didn't have glass. No Indian culture, basically, in North America had developed glass or much metals at all, in any case. There was a copper industry in Michigan, but it was basically raw copper that they pounded out into blades and things like that. So they didn't have these. They didn't have this metal. They didn't have these kind of things. They didn't have the chemistry. They didn't have anything like gunpowder or anything like that. So anything that the Europeans were able to trade with them was a big deal to them. But the razzle-dazzle kind of wore off right away. The beads continued. They were basically, most of the beads, to talk about them briefly, basically made in Austria, in Venice, in Austria, and they were traded all over the world. I mean, the African trade industry is tremendous, and that was in the mid-1800s. So this went on for quite a while. But the thrill of the beads kind of wore off, and Indians began to want the better things. They wanted metals, they wanted the pots, they wanted kettles, they wanted knives, and eventually guns. Interesting to note, too, that there was actually, as far as guns went, which is pretty much the way it's set up here, kind of goes through into the later stuff. The way guns went, they were very low-end trade guns that were made, flintlocks and all initially, and then into percussion. And they were made strictly for the Indian trade. They were kind of crappy. But there was an effort, a genuine effort by the traders, I guess whoever kind of planned this thing out, to get the Indians as many guns as possible. And someone might say, well, why would they do that? But these people quickly realized that these guys were deadly with bow and arrows. And in a matter of a minute, they could probably launch 25 arrows. A gun takes a minute to a minute and a half to prime and load and all that again. So they actually, it's some sort of a conspiratorial theory in history circles that they actually really kind of tried to plan to do the Indians out of their bows and arrows because they were so deadly and accurate. They weren't good at far distances, but they were tremendous. So they were getting in bed, selling them crappy guns that they knew they wouldn't take care of them. As you can see, any ones that I have in my collection that came from Indians were very rusted, very broken, very damaged. They didn't have the resources to repair them. They used leather and things like that. So basically what we have here is a lot of the different trade beads. They're really, even by today's standards, they're exquisite, some of these. These beads here, these red beads are called white heart beads. They're a red kind of a, you can come up and take a look after. They're a red kind of a pomegranate color, and the center is white. So if you look at them kind of closely, you can see sort of an iridescence to them. They're very pretty. There's melon seed beads that look like a melon. Some of the oldest beads, you see some of these blue ones here, are called padre beads. These are brought in by the Spanish. There's a couple of strings of them here. Now, these aren't found like this. You know, basically when they find beads, they're in an area where someone, you know, over maybe 100 or so years ago, they were lost or whatever, and then they're basically restrung. But there's different beads from different areas. There's a particular bead here. It's a blue one with facets. They call them Russians. They were never made for the Russians. They were made basically in Austria. They went through Russia, and they traded them down through the Bering Strait and down Alaska into the Pacific Northwest, and then down into California and into the plains. And they're one of the only faceted beads ever made. But they're interesting and they're beautiful. They're beautiful to hold. I'll take a few out and you can take a look, and they're beautiful to hold up to the light. And I mean the same attraction we would have for them. These guys never saw anything like that ever. So beads were a big deal. And there was different types, different sizes. These Padre beads, this is kind of the standard size that came in, and are very rare. But there was also ones that were made about the size of marbles that were basically exclusively for higher people in the tribe and things like that. So there was this kind of a system to it. A lot of times at the sites they come across pipes. These are pipes were found at a particular site. The trade pipes and some of the colonial pipes. Indians had smoked tobacco too. They had grown it here. I guess this is where tobacco came from, right? So that was a big thing. A lot of these bits of copper, if you take a look at these closely later on, rings and armbands and bangles and all that, these are all fused together. They were probably in some sort of a fire initially. These are found at an Indian site in the Finger Lakes region, an Iroquois site in the Finger Lakes region. Very popular, very, very popular items. You also see copper was sheet copper was traded, and they would cut them up into pieces to make arrow points and things like that. And if you come up and take a look at that, you'll see some of the different arrow points. These latter, these are from it was evidently an Indian battle site in Kansas. But this is, as opposed to having the stone tools, which, American Indians from the Paleo times until probably the 1500s, it was basically unchanged. They had basically a stone tool industry. They hunted and gathered and all that. Europeans came and everything changed. And then at that point, that was the end. From the 1500s till the 1800s, they were done. They're pretty much gone. Their lifestyle was changed and all that. And it was basically because of the introduction of all of these sorts of things that just changed everything. We have some trade knives, and then a lot of them look like ordinary knives, but this is a prized item to an Indian who was basically used to using a stone tool. Have something like this was pretty amazing, and used to help. This original one, I had seen these in some of the catalogs. It was originally a knife about this big, so it was quite long. But I mean, and used for, and I don't know if this happened under Indian use, because I found this at a flea market in Parsippany in a box of cutlery. So who knows where things end up and where they come from. Interesting too. They were very utilitarian. They had to. Yes, Steve.
Are the beads made of glass?
Yeah, they're glass beads.
Oh, they're glass.
Yeah, they're mostly all glass beads. I mean, there was bone beads and there's some copper, rolled copper, stuff like that. But these are all basically glass beads. And again, there was no glass in any of the Indian cultures at that point, so it was something pretty amazing. Thanks, Steve. I forgot what I was going to say.
I was holding that thought.
What happens too? They're very utilitarian, and a lot of the times in the tribes, if they had a knife or something like that and it broke, they couldn't just walk up to the trade post and say, "Hey, give me another knife." So they would repair things a lot or utilize other things. You'll take a look at some of this stuff. I was lucky enough to have a contact during the renovation of Fort Laramie, and we decided that was Wyoming, right? Fort Laramie. That when they were tearing up the floorboards to the fort, they were finding lots of Indian items under the floorboards, because it was actually used as a prison and things like that for a long time, and Indians lived in the fort. So a lot of these items, a couple of these knives and a couple of these blades, and one sort of a chopping device with some sort of hemp or something stuck in it and all that, were all found under the floorboards. Being utilitarian, this was found there too. Now this is obviously a hoe, and this is exactly as I had gotten how it was found, with this handle under the floorboards preserved. But this is actually the blade to the hoe is a pounded out ladle of some sort. And you can take a look at it, you can see where it's been pounded over and folded and all that. So they really utilize a lot of stuff. One of my favorite pieces from Fort Laramie was this, which again, this is exactly as I got it. And this is probably an 1860 or so cavalry sword that was basically broken down, handle off, and used however they would have used it for some sort of an agriculture or prying. It's pretty bent up sort of a use. Another one too that I had gotten this one outside of Philadelphia. This is a Revolutionary War naval sword, a cutlass of some sort that has a kind of a more modern looking handle. But again, the same thing. People were going to be continually using stuff. The trade period went in all the way up to until regular firearms and all that were basically traded, like I said. And the Indians were very abusive. They didn't have oils. They didn't have things like that. Technology like this was pretty much a new thing to them. And so you find a lot of these are very worn, very used, repaired with rawhide. And this particular one is fascinating in that it has, you can see where the original band was here, a very worn area here, very polished area here, was either for holding, but most likely for carrying on horseback against a horse or against a pommel or something like that. It's a very unique one. It has a lot of the nice original ornamentations and all that on it. But this is pretty much the end of it. After this sort of a thing happened and some of the last battles in the American West, as far as the East goes in this area, by 1700, 1790, 1800, the Indians are pretty much gone. Does anybody have Indian blood? Nobody?
In a jar, yeah.
I'm not giving anything away, but Adam's grandmother is a Leningrad, which I thought was kind of cool. Adam's from the Pine Barrens, you know, so that's a kind of a cool background. The reason why I asked that is because most Indians in this area, you know, they didn't just get rounded up and shot and all that. They went west, they walked out, and a lot of them were basically assimilated. I'm surprised to see that because I talk to, it seems like every third person that says, oh, you know, my grandmother's a Choctaw Indian or something like that. My own family, my mother's from the West Indies, from the Bahamas. Her great-great-grandmother was a Cherokee that, instead of taking the Trail of Tears to the west, went into Florida and hopped over into the Bahamas. And there's even a place in the Bahamas called Cherokee Sound, where I think Cherokee Indians settled in the Bahamas. And it's not much written about it, but that's what happened to a lot of people. They just basically got assimilated away and they were gone. And the last holdout people in the West was like where the Indian battles and all that stuff was in the plains, or where they were. You know, that was pretty much the end of it. After that, Buffalo Bill rounded up people and had Wild West shows and things like that, just so people could remember what it was like. And then it was over. So
they
that
opened up casinos.
Casinos? 7-Elevens. Oh, that's, sorry. Oh, Jay's not here, is he?
What's the two-bladed one on the long
Now, this one looks kind of newer. It has numbers on it. I got this from Frank Slaughter, who had a big collection, was the guy's name. And he had a big collection of Plains Indians, war clubs, and stuff like that. And this is evidently something his grandfather or somebody had collected one time or another. I have another thing I had, but my wife made me get rid of it. My wife is indigenous from Colombia. She did wonderful stitches. She gave me 4 stitches today. She's really good at it. But I brought home, my brother gave me a skull. It was a Cheyenne Indian woman's skull that he had gotten in New Mexico. And it had a, I showed it to an anthropologist. She suffered a tremendous whack to the back of the head, and it healed over. It was a big area. You could see it was kind of messed up. She had a copper staining around some parts of the skull where she was buried or something like that. A massive abscess up in here where the bone was all gone. And my wife wouldn't let me have it in the house. And I said, well, what if it was like a colonial guy?
Yeah, but it's a little spooky.
Well, not really. I guess it's dead. But I said, what if it was like a colonial guy or something? She goes, well, that's fine. So simply because it was a native Indian woman, she wouldn't let me have it in the house. So my brother has it. It's a beautiful piece.
Better at your brother's house than your house.
What's that?
Better at your brother's house than your
No.
house.
Another interesting item too, as a lot of trade had gone on and Indians began to move up and acquire firearms and all that towards the basically end of the period, pieces like this. This was found in a burned Navajo hogan in a burnt water reservation in New Mexico. It's an 1860 Navy revolver. Well, the remains of it, the backstrap and all, and the wood, of course, is gone. But that's the sort of thing that's found at later sites. But what I was saying is it's kind of tragic if you think about this whole thing. And again, I'm not and saying anything bad about Europeans or anything like that because it's just the way it is. But Indians lasted for 15,000 years, basically living pretty much the same life that they did. They didn't progress that much, but they basically kept their lifestyle as it was. And in the 300-year period, they were gone. They were just gone. And these are the traces of that brief period where they were making contact, historically where they're making contact. Now, last thing I'm going to say is take a good look at some of this stuff because it's important to us as people that are walking around with metal detectors is you can clearly find something like this, pieces of brass, pieces of copper like this, points and things like that, and not know what they are and just throw them in the scrap bag. So look at some of this stuff closely, especially these copper items, because you all may have dug things up and not known it. I never have.
We went to a hunt out in by the Susquehanna. Had a hunt out by the what's the Blowing Big River right there. Susquehanna River. And the field where we had the hunt right there, they found some copper triangular points. And the one guy was all excited because he said that was a trade item, basically from the Indians. He said, you know, they would trade for a copper coffee pot or teapot. They would use that so much they would burn the bottom out on the campfires,
Cut 'em
and then
up.
once the bottom was out, they would cut the thing up and make points for the arrows. And
Well,
stuff.
one thing I
So
don't
they're
have
very
represented
ingenious.
here is the silver too. You see a lot of the silver was used that way, where the missionaries were giving the Indians silver crosses and things like that. And you see some early silver coinage from the 1600s that Indians had fashioned into different things. You know, you have to think about it. I mean, I have hundreds and hundreds, as well as you, arrowheads, if not thousands of arrowheads. They're actually fairly common. You know, common implement used for thousands and thousands of years. This is a brief period, you know, and so that the little window to find some of this copper stuff or some of this trade stuff is small and makes it even that much more special. And again, like I said, it was the beginning of the end, so it's just you know, kind of a poignant sort of a thing. The beads are beautiful. I'd be happy to take some out, let you guys look at them and all that stuff. That's pretty much it.
Anybody have questions for Pete? Pete's also going to be writing the new column on Indian artifacts in American Digger magazine, starting, I guess, with maybe the December issue or so, or
I think January. I've
January
written
issue.
like 4 months already, so
yeah, he sent in a couple articles already, so look for that
Yeah.
coming out. That's going to be a great thing. He has